everyone, we're at High Falls Conservation Area in Columbia County, which is also the same county that Wally Farms is in. And I wanted to bring you here because there's a lot of bedrock outcropping, and in the northeast of the United States that's actually kind of a problem for geologists because obviously we love trees and vegetation and soil, but it makes it difficult sometimes to know what bedrock is under all of that. So we come to places like this where there's a stream or a waterfall where the rocks are outcropping and we can get a good idea of what's going on in the subsurface. And I brought you here because the rocks here are not exactly the same, but they're pretty similar to the ones that are the bedrock at Wally Farms. We are near the tectonic range, which formed during the tectonic orogeny that I'm going to tell you a little bit about later in this video. And we're going to see a really beautiful waterfall. We're going to walk on this beautiful trail with this mossy covered rocks in the stream and slanted rock layers and just a generally beautiful area. So come with me and I'll show you the rocks. So the rocks that you'll see here at High Falls are a sedimentary rock called shale, but there's more of metamorphic rocks, mostly slate and phyllite. And these all sound like kind of confusing words, especially shale and slate get confused so much between the two. And that's because, well, one, they sound really similar, and two, they look really similar, and they're made of the same thing. So all of these rocks here started out as muds. Where I'm standing was once at the bottom of a very, very deep ocean, about 500 million years ago. And there were sediments, there were muds essentially, that were deposited at the bottom of that ocean. And millions of years later, there was this mini continent that ended up colliding with the ancient continent of North America. So the mini continent, let's pretend these rocks are the continents. Pretend this is the mini continent, and because of plate tectonics, it's moving towards the main continent. In between that, there's all this mud at the bottom of the ocean between them. And when they collide, all of those muds at the bottom kind of got squished. They didn't really have anywhere to go, so they got squished and thrusted up towards the continent of ancient North America. And that's what we're seeing here. That's how all of these deep ocean sediments ended up at the surface, and that's why we see them today. So the reason that I'm holding these rocks is because they look really flat, and they also look kind of shiny, especially if you hold them in the sun. They give off sort of a shimmer, and that's because of something called foliation that happens when rocks get metamorphosed. So these rocks started out as mud, and they went through sort of a sequence. So they're at a step in a sequence right now where mud will go and turn into shale, which is a sedimentary rock, and then during metamorphism, shale will turn into slate, and then the next step is phyllite, and then there's schist. And I would think of it as baking cookies. So, which I just did this last night, which is why I'm thinking about it. Think of it as you take the dough, the cookie dough. Pretend that's the mud, and you put it in the oven, and say you really like your cookies kind of gooey and not super crispy and brown, you'll take those out, and that would be considered the shale. If you wanted to keep it in the oven more and have it be a little more brown and crispy, you keep it in, and that would be the slate. And you keep going, and the more crispy, maybe burnt, that the cookies get, that's a more cooked version of the rock. So you're just thinking about cooked mud, essentially. And that's what these rocks are. So we're kind of at the middle step where these are not shale, but they're also not quite schist. So they're a little shiny because those clay minerals, those muds have been compacted and squished just enough to be compacted and flattened so that they break into these little perfect sheets and look shiny and maybe sometimes a little wavy. But they also still look a little boring, just like shale does. And you'll see the difference between this and schist, where schist tends to have a little bit more pretty textures. It would be like wavy sometimes, and it'll sometimes have things like garnet and other fun minerals where boring rocks like this don't always have. So when you see rocks like this that are kind of brittle and breaking apart, you'll notice that they naturally break on these planes or these layers. And slate rocks like this have historically been used widely in making shingles because of the way they break like this. So here we are at the waterfall. It's pretty amazing, honestly. I forgot how tall it was, and you'll also notice a big part of this is that the rocks are really slanted. I realize now that it was way too loud for me to continue that, but essentially what I was trying to say is that those really cool looking slanted layers, those used to be those muds at the bottom of the ocean where they started out horizontally as layers, and then they were compacted and thrusted upward during the tectonic orogeny to where we can see them today at the surface. So you may have noticed with the waterfall and where we've been walking that we're in a gorge. We're in a little bit of a valley where there's kind of steep trails going up to the waterfall. If you come here, you'll definitely notice it. That is because of the last ice age, well, technically the current ice age, but the most recent glaciation, the Wisconsin glaciation that I briefly mentioned in the first video. This happened about from 100,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago, where a continental ice sheet covered a large portion of North America. And it was here in the Hudson Valley where we had our very own glacier or multiple glaciers. And they are the reason, the glacier is the reason that the area is sculpted the way it is. And actually a lot of the waterfalls and the lakes and the streams and many of the hills and other landforms are actually there because of the ice. Part of it is because of the way that the ice, the pressure of it, how it scrapes away sediment and bedrock that was there before, but also because of the sediments and rocks that are carried in an ice sheet that are then dropped in different ways when that ice eventually leaves. So the waterfall here was actually formed during the last glaciation when the ice was starting to leave, and there was tons of meltwater coming off of that ice and flowing off of it into places like this and carving a gorge with all of that water. And then when the ice was eventually gone, the waterfall kind of stayed behind, and we can still see it today along with the creek. So that is it for today's little field trip. I hope that bringing you on this little walk with me in the woods to see the rocks has helped you peek into the mind a little bit of a geologist, more specifically a geologist in the Hudson Valley, and that you now know a little bit more about the natural history of the area, whether you're from here and have been here your entire life and have been curious about how all this got here, or you just moved here, or you're here temporarily and you're just curious about it as well. Either way, I hope that this helped open a door to you and maybe made you a little more curious about other stories that rocks can tell us, and how geologists can kind of act as detectives, kind of like rock detectives. We know we can look at things in the rocks and kind of piece together a story of what happened here way before humans were ever present on the planet, and that's pretty cool. So join me next time for the next episode where we'll be at Wally Farms to learn a little bit about the geology there and how it affects farming.